Hello, welcome to lesson 1.4. In today's lesson, we'll look at very quickly at the extreme example of soil destruction, which happened across the 1930s in the US during the Dust Bowl era, the Great Depression of the US, and how that was directly related to the way the soil was treated. And we also look at in that example the principles used to restore the soil that was so damaged that it turned entire ecosystems into desert. And then also we'll look at the different requirements that we need to uphold in order for soils to be restored. Okay, so let's jump into lesson 1.4. So to show you an extreme example of how this looks in a very, very sort of a short period of time in human history, I want to introduce you to this Dust Bowl phenomenon that happened in the 1930s across the decade, and really recommend watching these two brief videos about it from 1950s. Really cool, even though very sad, but very cool. So the Great Plains of the US, they basically were prairie grasslands, pretty much desert, semi-desert area where it was deemed to be unsuitable for cultivation. So no one went there. But post-Civil War, obviously there was problems in the country, and so farmers moved in, and they really believed that rain will follow the plow. So between 1900 and 1930s, mechanized plowing came in, and tractors and combines, and started really moving the vegetation out of the landscape. So between 1900 and 1920, farmland doubled, and between 25 and 30, it tripled. So people just en masse came and invaded this once very interesting environment where it was just covered with these grasslands that bison would have fed on. At that time, actually, the bison were completely almost eliminated. They were all culled. So basically, they just wanted to remove the buffalo, take away the food source of the indigenous people, to force them into giving up their land. And with the advent of mechanized plow, tractors, combines, and the grazing of the animals that were introduced, this has caused severe erosion of the landscape and therefore desertification in a very short period of time once the droughts came. And this is what happens in the whole process of when we want to change ecosystems. So tillage and grazing removed native grasses, and that led to erosion. And this is what it looked like, but it's not supposed to look like that. What it's supposed to look like is this amazing long-rooted system where all the different plants have different root architecture and length. And when you look at it across how large they are, and here is an example of when they cultivated properly versus our agricultural crops, this image went viral, and there's a lot of argument about this particular image. But it isn't far from truth, and definitely these native grasses, this is what they're supposed to be like. This is what the landscape was held by, and this is why it could withstand heat and drought and all kinds of things, and and be resilient. But once this multi-species long-rooted cover crop was removed, and we only started putting in monocrops that couldn't handle being introduced to this new landscape, drastic consequences occurred. This is what happened, really. You could see that while everything was removed where the plow went through, there was only like these little islands of these giant grasses in isolation. And in fact, this is where the prairie grass that hasn't been removed, this is the soil where the soil would have been. You look at that difference in when the guy is standing here. So I don't know how many, but probably, 30, 40, maybe 60 centimeters, maybe more of this topsoil has been removed completely, blown away with this dust bowl. So here we go, between 1930 and 38, severe drought occurred. And so by then the land has been plowed severely. Greenhouse gases were going up into the atmosphere in large amounts and changing the climate already back then. Rainfall was reduced by 25%, from 20 inches to 15. In those 2 years, were 34 and 36 were the records of 20th century hottest summers in 20th century on record, 40 heat wave days, more than 44-degree temperatures at some locations, million acres turned to dust and blew away, basically. Soil turned to dust, and this was called the Black Blizzard. 75% of topsoil blown away in some areas. Huge destruction. Poverty, famine, people had to move. They couldn't eat. They couldn't breathe. Children were dying from basically breathing this dust, and they would get infections in the lungs. Lots of people died. as a result. And if you think our masks for COVID were cool, check these out. But yeah, terrible, terrible consequences. And then eventually the government realized 16 million acres destroyed in Texas by erosion. So they basically started paying farmers to terrace and protect their farms. The civilian conservation corps planted 200 million trees between Texas and Canada to block wind and hold soil. And conservation techniques like crop rotation, contour plowing, and terracing started being incentivized at $1 per acre. And by the end of 1930, 65% reduction in the dust blow occurred. So it started to settle. And then at the end of that, Franklin Roosevelt said, "A nation that destroys its soils destroys itself." How true is that? Very sad story. And there's now drone footage shown in 2020 in New South Wales is actually showing exactly the same thing. So we have these dust storms already. They're happening, especially in parts of Western Australia where the native vegetation has been removed. This is normal out there. So the present day greenhouse gases could cause more frequent and longer Dust Bowl heat waves, a study done by Cohen et al. In 2020. So if you guys want to look that up, that study's there. But basically, this is a summary by mid-1930s. It's now been shown that greenhouse gases were prominent in the atmosphere and were increasing heat wave days frequency because this was the industrial era. All the industry was pumping from the early 1900s, probably mid-1800s up to then. And then, of course, everything was being mechanized. So North Atlantic and cool tropical Pacific Sea surface temperature anomalies forced upper-level ridge over continental US, so basically that weakened moisture movement from the Gulf of Mexico. And then the study asked, well, how the 1930s heat waves would behave with present greenhouse gas effects in the atmosphere. And they're predicting much more severe consequences, where it used to be 1 in 100 years in 1936 prediction of this happening. Now it's 1 potentially in every 40 years. And the key driver is reduced evaporative cooling. That's, of course, because we're removing vegetation, and increased sensible heat exchange. So that means changes in temperature, basically, and the evaporative cooling driving this effect. So this is quite severe, and it's predicting quite awful consequences for us if we continue to do the destructive agricultural ways. And there's huge greenhouse gas emission produced by agricultural sector, 29%. So between 2000 and 2009, degraded land emissions were equivalent to 4.4 billion tons of carbon dioxide emission. Fertilizer manufacture and application is the main source of emissions. You wouldn't think this, but the amount of energy and fuel it takes to actually produce fertilizer is huge. And of course, transportation's got a huge effect as well. Like, for example, having to transport frozen meat. You can imagine how many truckloads have to go around to service every Woolworths. So when you start thinking in those terms, the actual refrigeration, the actual transport, all these things have huge impacts. Of course, fertilizer excess as well produces eutrophication in aquatic environments, and that creates algal blooms, which are toxic and deplete and deprive oxygen for fish and benthic invertebrates. These are animals that live on the bottom of water bodies, and it produces their death. So it's a huge consequence to biodiversity loss. And of course, as that runs off from rivers into estuaries, there's coral bleaching. All of agricultural sort of not only the temperature that we're producing through these practices that increases of the ocean, but also the fact that there's poisons directly running off into these systems. And that, of course, increases drylands. So our deserts increase, especially in Australia, but everywhere in the world, really. Causes erosion, salinity, acidity, and decreases cropping areas. So that's what it looks like when it's affected and no crop can grow anymore. And this is just a mild picture compared to what I've showed you earlier, like this one, for example, where 2/3 of Australian agricultural land is degraded by soil erosion, salinity, acidity, and contamination. And it's really time to restore our soils back to life. And how could we do this? Well, we can basically minimize and avoid soil disturbance by direct drilling to ensure survival of microbes, and growing plants in areas where they're not growing anymore. We can introduce plants that can do well, like, for example, our native grasses that are adapted to already harsh conditions. And a lot of those can actually be consumed as well, by the way. They can be our grains with those long root systems that you've seen in the prairie grasses, similar situation. We can plant diversity of families where the plant exudate or the sugars that come from a plant and the organic matter diversity that these plants will produce will directly feed microbial diversity. We'll produce that by attracting these microbes and by the microbes changing their genes, because that's what microbes can do. This would actually improve nutrient cycle as well and plant immunity, because when we have diversity of plants, there's really so much added to the whole system that plants just cycle better. They just live better in communities. That's what nature does. That's what nature is designed to do. It's designed to live in community of diversity. Nothing's in monoculture. We can provide perennial ground cover to feed microbes, continually having the ground covered, never having anything taken off the land and the roots removed. That's like key. We always want to ensure some soil moisture, but if we don't have that moisture, what do? Well, we plant plants that can actually survive harsher conditions, drier conditions, and grow them first, and they will create that organic matter, and that moisture will be then retained in the soil for longer periods of time. And eventually, if we do something like agroforestry or syntropic farming, where we can incorporate plants or grow our foods on the edges of forests and grow forests, moisture can be created by the plants that grow. So the more biodiversity we have, obviously, the larger the trees can grow, the more water is evaporated and evaporative cooling occurs, and therefore moisture is retained. So we can retain crop residue as well, mulch to increase soil organic matter and fungal biomass, and cultivate beneficial microbes. And we'll go through all this, obviously. This is just introducing what we're going to talk about, really. We can monitor microbial activity and diversity and apply compost, extracts, and teas. And I think we're going to talk about this in the next lesson, just so you guys can get started on doing your own preparations rather than waiting for the course to finish and then in the last lesson have that. So I want to start encouraging you to start creating microbial diversity on your land before you even learn about it. But I'll go through that and we'll learn about each of the microbes and how they can be strengthened, their numbers can be grown. So all of this then increases soil moisture, structure and drought resistance, carbon sequestration, nutrient availability and cycling, plant immunity and vigor, and animal and human nutrition. And this eliminates weeds, fertilizer and pesticide costs, and reduces the workload for the farmer. So this is the beauty of doing the regenerative way of getting the soil restored. These are the references for today and from the first lesson as well. So you can look those up. And I really encourage you to do your own investigations as well. I don't think that it's good just to rely on me. I think one of the best ways to study is to write notes as you listen. That's what I've always found whenever I've learned anything, was because I was writing while I was listening. That's always good. So if you want to retain the information, engage it. The more you engage it, the more you'll actually learn, and the more it will hit your heart, and the more light bulb moments will occur. Just engage with the content and go and play in nature and have fun with it and experiment. And we'll talk about some of these experimentations as we go along. So thanks for listening, and see you in lesson 2.